But first of all, I'd like to welcome to our members and to all our non-members who are participating with us here this evening. And we trust you will enjoy this meeting. This evening, Simon Green is telling us about the blockhouses and the traces the soldiers left behind. I'm sure everyone traveling within South Africa is aware of the blockhouses, but not many know of the stories behind them. As with the notice, Simon Green was born in the United Kingdom. He attended Sandhurst, the premier officer training school in the United Kingdom. He was stated in the Royal Signal Corps. He tells me he was rejected by the Sappers, which is the Royal Engineering Corps, but he realized that the military mistakenly rejected him. His application into the Sappers, his interest in this subject was roused while reading an article in the Getaway magazine. The blockhouse represent a stark reminder to us all of the Anglo-Boer War, close to many of the hearts of many South Africans. I don't think many of us, myself included, ever think about those men who accepted the king's shilling to come far away to South Africa to fight for a war over who knows what. I was saddened when I traveled through Europe many years ago and England. In fact, staggered in every village and every town stood an obelisk or a market cross honoring the dead of that village with a staggering amount of names that had fought in the Anglo-Boer War. It is therefore with great pleasure that I present you to Simon to carry on with this interesting story. Thank you, Simon.
David, thanks very much. Firstly, thank you very much for the, excuse me, thank you very much for the invite. Very honored to be here. I've done one presentation, I think, prior to genealogy, so I've put a little bit more into this, and I'm going to start with some genealogy. I'll come to my story, and we'll come to blockhouses and their legacy they leave behind. But interesting what David said about Europe. We're going kind of back to Europe in a minute. So I'm going to explain some genealogy, how I got started in genealogy in the kind of 1990s, my background, what my current passion is, the Blockhouse Story. We're going to talk about built environment genealogy, which is kind of people's graffiti and what they leave behind on the wall, and how that can be traced to individuals. And then we're going to look at the traces of war and what I called genearchaeology. So finding things in the ground and attributing them to people and regiments and people that came in this country and dropped stuff and left stuff behind. So where did it all start for me? Well, it started with this. This is a soldier's book, belonged to this gentleman here, a guy called Private Arthur Hales, who would have been my great uncle had he survived the Great War. And this was his pocketbook, which was crammed full of Christmas greeting cards and all the little bits and pieces of information that soldiers carried around with them in the Great War. And this came into my possession. And it came into my possession just prior to going on a battlefield tour to Europe, to the World War I battlefield sites. And I was able to piece together with all the various documents that I've got, and they're all kind of original documents and original letters written by his friends telling the story of what happened to poor Arthur. And poor Arthur was initially in the yeomanry, transferred to various units, had various numbers, and is very kind of easy to trace, and left a lot of kind of legacy items behind in terms of genealogy, and it was a very, very interesting story to tell. Basically, Arthur got captured in 1918 towards the end of the war when the Germans had their final offensive, the Kaiserslaut. And he was captured by the Germans, taken to a German prisoner of war camp somewhere. And whilst poor Arthur was helping the chef to cook the daily meal, a flying bomb landed between him and the chef and killed poor Arthur. And this is his grave. You'll note by this time he's actually a Lancashire Fusiliers, His pocketbook has got various numbers on for the Lancashire Fusiliers, for the Royal Rifle Corps, for the 4th West Yorkshires, and numerous other regiments. So Arthur got around quite a bit, but I was able, after I think 3 days of traveling the battlefields of France and Germany, where you see thousands of graves, thousands of tombstones like this, and thousands of names. And it's a very sobering thought, and it sobered me into researching my family history. And as a result of poor Arthur's demise, and telling the story to a group of my colleagues over his grave, we stood right next to his grave. I placed that cross there, and we told his story. And it's very poignant when you talk about hundreds of thousands of people dying in one day to tell the story of one man. And that's really where genealogy can lead you, is by telling the story of one man. You can tell almost the story of an entire nation. 19-year-old boys are still going to war and dying, by the way. And as we go through this presentation, I'm going to look back in history. I'm also going to draw parallels with exactly what's happening today in Ukraine with the Ukraine-Russian war as well. So that got me started on genealogy. I then was fortunate enough to find out I had other great uncles who served in the Great War. Here's poor Arthur here, who we've just described, and he had a brother, younger brother, Sidney. I think Sidney's about 15 in this picture. Very, very young indeed, and he went off to war. And there was another family also who went away to war, the Featherby family. And I came into possession of all of Hugh Featherby's items. This is his pay book, and I came into possession of all his items that he took to war as well. And Hugh Featherby survived the war. Hugh Featherby had a brother called Fred Featherby, and he died as well. And how did these two families join together? Well, down here is my Grandma Edith Hales, and here is my Auntie Anne Featherby, nee Hales. And what happens is these two guys were comrades in the same regiment. Poor Sidney rather got gassed. And when Hugh came to visit him, whilst he was invalided from the battlefield, came to visit young Sidney, who was blind and I don't think he lived for very long after the battle. But when he came to visit Sidney, he met Anne, my Auntie Anne, and they later got married. And this is how the two families joined together. When Sidney got gassed, it was Hugh who helped him on the back of the wagon to get off the battlefield. And as a result of that comradeship, then came to visit him and married into the family. And that's how the two families kind of joined. So that got me started on a passion for genealogy. And then I researched both my mother's and father's lines back to about the 60s, when I ran out of internet time. Couldn't do anything more on the internet, and I would have had to have gone around all the parish records and everything like that. So okay, kind of came to a close, but that was my passion for genealogy, and that's how I got started really on the whole history thing, because I hated history at school. I didn't like it that much at all. We studied the Industrial Revolution, which I did quite like, but all the other kind of kings and queens stuff didn't relate to me very much. So let's tell kind of my story as well, because we've all got a story to tell. As David said, I was in the army for nearly 30 years. I came to South Africa in 2002, served in the South African Defence Force. So I've got a South African medal in my collection. And then left the army in 2006 to work in defence consulting. But whilst I was here, I met somebody. And I think, David, you were telling a story of a South African guy marrying a British lady. Well, I was the other way around. I was a British guy who married a South African lady. So when I left the army after living in London for a while, doing more research, because London's a really cool place to do research with the National Archives right on my doorstep in South London. I moved here in 2007, worked for Denel Aerostructures for a while, building parts for Airbus, and at this time started my research on blockhouses. I'll kind of come into that story later on. I left Denel to work for G4S, very topical security company. There were crooks back then, and they're still crooks today. They retrenched me, sadly, in 2014. Certainly the wrong side of 50, the wrong nationality, the wrong color, and I was really the wrong guy in all the wrong places. But it did allow me to sit at the computer and really, really start to dig deep on blockhouses and the story of blockhouses. My birth sign, I'm a Virgo, so Virgos go broad and deep. There's no detail too detailed for a Virgo, so I like my detail, and I being a former engineer, love numbers and proving things with numbers. As a result of sitting at the computer, got a really bad back. My wife got fed up with me. There's a familiar story on the whole trail of historians and genealogy. And after my bad back, took me to a body stress release practitioner who said to me after a few sessions, well, you've got a similar life story to me. Why don't you become a practitioner? So I did. In 2015, I became a body stress release practitioner. That's the work that pays for the history stuff and the writing books, really. My passions these days, trust in something bigger than you. We're all fragile and going to move on from this earth at some point in life. Have fun, keep learning, empower others, and give back daily. That's my kind of mantra for everything I do. So I'm here because I love what I do, and I've got a passion for it. So why is history and heritage important? Well, this is a quote from a guy called Ronald Balfour, who said, no age lives entirely alone. Every civilization is formed not merely by its own achievements, but what it has inherited from the past. If these things are destroyed, we have lost a part of our past and we should be the poorer for it. Major Ronald Balfour, hit the beaches on D-Day and was tasked with recovering all the looted Nazi treasure. And it became a very good book, The Monuments Men, and quite a good Hollywood movie as well. So heritage is important to us because it's the foundation in which everything we do today is rooted. And I always say to people, if you are happy with where you are today, you have to accept history, the good bits and the bad bits, is everything that brought us to this point, have to be memorialized and regarded in some way. Else, what are we going to learn from history? So we've got a lot to learn from our heritage. This is the Getaway article that started it. There is the Lanesburg Blockhouse on the N12, probably the most familiar blockhouse, being very well repurposed by the local police who hide behind it with a speed camera. And no doubt a few people have been caught there now and then. So I saw this, it piqued some old, long forgotten former Royal Engineer refusal spark in me somewhere. To have a look at what blockhouses were and all about them. And I started reading, and every book I read had the same old 3 or 4 pages in. And I thought to myself, there must be something kind of more to this than just these pages. And there was a much deeper story. There was an engineer story. So in the first book, I call Anglo-Boer War Blockhouses, a military engineer's perspective. And the engineer's perspective has 2 parts of it. One is the detail that I went into in terms of how many were built. One of the first things I did was take the numbers that were in the engineer reports, put them in a spreadsheet and recalculated them. And guess what? The numbers were wrong. Good old engineers back in the day couldn't do maths that well, and then added up some of the figures. And every figure that was in every history book that had been written had used the same figure, and it was wrong. So that got me on the way to looking at things with a fresh eye and looking at history with some modern day tools like spreadsheets, like other analysis, and coming up with kind of alternative narratives to some good old fashioned staid stories that are quite often written as an accepted narrative, which are always worth challenging. So I started on my journey. What really interests me is kind of geography and landscape and buildings and all that kind of hard stuff and what's left behind. Originally, I was writing 1 book. It really became 2 books. 1 book to tell the story of blockhouses, and the second one to really act as a field guide to get people's muddy feet on the ground to go and look at some of the ones that are in some faraway places. I spent from 2009 to about 2020 researching. I had a mountain of work, probably over 100,000 words, which during lockdown, my wife said to me, time to do something with this, matey. You've dragged me around these places for the past 12, 13 years time, you wrote a book. So that was my COVID. My COVID 2.5 months, I finished off the book on blockhouses. Book 1 and then book 2 is going to follow very, very kind of closely behind that. So let me tell you the story of blockhouses, how they came about, and what really is left in the country. So what is a blockhouse? Well, here are 2 blockhouses, very different ones. This particular one here is very close to me. It's the closest blockhouse to me in Meyerton in southern Johannesburg. And this is a really nice picture of it from about 10, 12 years ago, one of the first ones I took. It's now got a very big crack coming down the wall here. These steel bands have been removed. The door is gone. The steel loopholes have gone, and it's about to fall down. And in the last 12 years, myself and a local lady have battled with Sahara to try and get them to do something, and who refuse to act, who refuse to invoke anything to do with the National Heritage Act to preserve it. Sadly enough, I'm busy trying to engage anybody who'll listen to me, including Gator Mackenzie at the moment, to try and get the government to do something about it to save it. But that is one of the about 400 of these kind of masonry ones that were built. The smaller ones, I'm going to kind of come on to the story of how they came about, but much smaller, still quite strong and defensive, but built with kind of a sandwich layer on top of corrugated iron filled with stone, which is bulletproof, and they were very cheap to make. These initial ones, quite expensive, and I'll tell you the kind of phases of how they were built and what they were built for, but really to defend things, key points, bridges, railway lines. They are primarily defensive structures, but in the later part of the war really became an offensive system that was used as part of a wider strategy in defeating the Boer commandos. So these are individual things put on the ground. And what happened over time was that they got linked together. Here's a blockhouse with kind of bird's eye view looking down on the top here, linked together, not with a straight line, with a kind of zigzag trench system, because we had rifles that fired along the line, and you don't want to fire at your mate in the next blockhouse. So these rifles fired along the wire, and along the wire you had anti-mobility ditches to prevent horses and ox wagons and things like that going over them. So over the period of the war, there was what's called a blockhouse system deployed. Some, in the original books, it says 8,000. My calculations to date are on about 9,200 blockhouses and small forts that were built. So with my research, been challenging the accepted narrative, as I said, and challenging the numbers that were in there. This is a blockhouse with about 6 or 7 guys in, anti-mobility trenches. And over the period of the war, bearing in mind the war lasted, nearly 2.5 years, 9,200 of these were made. And the system became a number of components. So if we talk about the blockhouse system, because I like systems, I'm an engineer, remember, and I was a systems engineer to boot. These are all the various components that fed in to make a system of blockhouses that went from in the north, from Polokwane in the north down to Simonstown, and then from west to east, from Lambert's Bay all the way across the country, through the Free States, into KwaZulu-Natal and down to Durban. So north, south, east and west, the blockhouses were deployed. And in the guidebook, I kind of tell you where all those are, and you can go and visit them. So what was in the blockhouse system? Well, there's a lot of soldiers for a start off. About 60,000 regular soldiers manned the blockhouse. Bear in mind, all but 2 regiments in the British Army of the period came to South Africa at that time. 450,000 men and nurses circulated through South Africa and the war, engaged in the fighting. Probably the maximum was about 220,000. So there's a lot of people, and not just British soldiers, Imperial soldiers, and also blackguards as well. I reckon there was about 20,000 black soldiers or black labourers employed in either building the blockhouse system or acting as night guards. We had a supply system, rail carts, water tanks, ration, ammunition. You put 60,000 men in the field from Polokwane to Cape Town, Lambert's Bay to Durban. Quite a logistical nightmare in terms of keeping them fed and watered. There was a communication system, heliographs, mirrors, telegraphs, telephones, semaphore flags, runners, the good old bugle. For the first time ever, wireless radio was used in the South African War early on, not adopted by the army, but it was later adopted by the Navy. So again, the war in South Africa was one with a lot of firsts. And the blockhouse system and the protection system, there was the blockhouse itself, bulletproof, not artillery proof, because at the time when they were starting to be built, most of the artillery pieces had been taken off the battlefield, off the Boer side, so there was no need for strong artillery protection. But rifle racks, landmines, trenches, night guards, observation posts, and finally there was an alarm system, some sort of tin cans on there, chemical alarms, flares, and things to illuminate the wire at night time. So that was the blockhouse system, not just a blockhouse, but now we're considering a system. So how was it deployed? Well, in the early parts of the war, January till about December, after the Boer invasion of Natal and the Cape Colony, it was decided that the Cape Colony railways and infrastructure was vulnerable to attack. So 18 of these, what were termed Elliott Wood blockhouses, were built between, I think the furthest one south down the railway line is Wellington, and then the most northerly one up the line is probably Beaufort West. And there was 18 of them built, each for about £1,000, 800 to £1,000 at the time, and they were there to defend the bridges. So what in the military is termed KP defence or key point defence. These things were built. Quite expensive to build, quite a long time to build. The shortest time, I think, was about 3 months. Supervised by the Royal Engineers, built by the military and under contract as well. A couple of them are built from concrete, quite uniquely. One in Merriman, and the one at Lanesburg is also built of concrete as well. Quite new material for the day. As the war progressed and the war was taken past the three sieges stage, remember there was three towns besieged by the Boers: Kimberley, Ladysmith, and Mafeking. After those sieges were relieved and Roberts and Kitchener's army came to take Pretoria, it was considered by the British at the time that once the capitals fell, the war was going to be over. Not so was the reply from the Boer forces at the time, who decided to continue the war and continue the war as a guerrilla war. The initial phase of the guerrilla war was in attacking the railway line from Pretoria to Lorenzo Marques, which was a key point then for supplies coming in. And this Delagoa Bay railway line was subject to attacks by the train wreckers, people like Jack Hindon, half British, half Irish guy who had a particular penchant for blowing British stuff up with dynamite, as the Irish have been doing for a number of years, and was very effective at blowing up the railway line and disrupting supplies into Pretoria and Johannesburg. And there was a need for more blockhouses quickly. Major Spring Rice of the Royal Engineers was instrumental in designing initially an octagonal blockhouse, which you see here, surrounded by a revetment of stones, to deploy these quickly. Much cheaper to build than the original stone ones, and now cost only £16 to £20 to build and could be erected in about 2 or 3 days to get guys in them. So this line was heavily blockhoused between January and March onwards to protect the railway lines, and was very effective. And in terms of the effectiveness in the book, I kind of draw graphs and put some empirical data on how effective they were at defeating the train attacks. And over a period of about 3 or 4 months, the train attacks stopped because the blockhouse line was so well defended. So that that line, having been well defended, also meant that over a period of time, now all the other rail links, all the other networks from Norval's Pont, from PE, from Durban, from the Cape Colony, from Lorenzo Marx, and the line up to Polokwane was also vulnerable to attack, and that was the kind of huge industrialization phase that came, where these sorts of blockhouses now transitioned from being octagonal to being round, like a rondavel, much easier to build, much stronger, and cheaper and quicker to erect as well. Made in flat pack kits. If you want to talk about the IKEA flat pack furniture of its day, these blockhouses were exactly that. All the parts pre-numbered, pre-assembled, disassembled, put in packs and shipped, 50 a week, built in about 6 or 7 factories scattered around the country. And this is where we get the kind of the huge phase of building that went on with blockhouses. Some things were converted. This looks like a windmill. It's actually an old water tank. Where is that? In Newport. And these are some of the survivors that I've listed in the book. So what happened in the final phase of the war? The final phase of the war is where the Boer forces then decided to take the fight into the Cape Colony, and people like Smuts and other commandos decided to raid into the Cape Colony with the aim of raising a rebellion for anyone who was a sympathizer in the Cape Colony. So the guerrilla phase now meant that the British had to chase and track down the Boers on horseback. Not only did they have to defend all the towns in the Cape Colony, they raised about 125 town guards. Each town guard had probably a minimum of 4 small forts and sangers spread around it, some of which are still left. The one you see here is at Richmond. Got the 2 flags on, flown by the owner. And many of these small forts survive as well. So I put some of those in the book as well, where they're kind of worth a visit and not too far away. So how did the British end up defeating the commandos who were roving and causing havoc? No need for fixed battles anymore. It was a classic kind of guerrilla hit and run. Interestingly enough, from my own family heritage, there is a really strong link, and the really strong link is game shooting. All the gentlemen that I described from the Great War came from an estate in Lincolnshire. That estate in Lincolnshire was owned by a guy called Sir Montague Cholmondeley. Sir Montague Cholmondeley was killed in the Great War in 1914, and then all his staff then went off to serve. And my great-great-grandfather was his gamekeeper. So what's the link with the Boer War? Well, guess what? The tactic that was used by Robertson Kitchener to track down the Boer forces was born out of an estate shoot. And how an estate shoot works is you create a number of shooting butts where you stand with your fine pair of Purdy shotguns and your helper, and the rest of the estate workers go off into the estate and beat the birds, beat with sticks and shout and scream onto the butts where you stand and shoot the birds. This is exactly the tactic that the British used to hunt down the Boer commandos. Basically, the blockhouse lines and the railway lines were the butts, supported by armoured trains. And then what's called drives or roving columns. Literally, men stood shoulders to shoulders, spread 20 kilometres across the veldt, drove forward with a commando somewhere in front of it with the aim of capturing it. That was the aim. And that was really the culmination of the blockhouse system, was that if you can imagine, the railway network in South Africa was the spine, and then various parts of the railway line were connected with cross-country blockhouse lines that didn't follow railway lines to create a net. So this network of blockhouses around the country was used by, latterly in the war, by Kitchener to drive the Boer commandos onto the blockhouse lines, which you would imagine are impervious to people getting across. Well, they weren't. They weren't impervious at all. And what happened is after each drive, particular de Wet will be able to get across the blockhouse line and kind of regroup the other side and head off somewhere else. Every time a commando crossed the blockhouse line, it lost something. It lost some horses, it lost some supplies, it lost some men, and over a period of time, there was a huge kind of degradation of what happened. So in the book, I kind of explained this strategy, and these are the components of Kitchener's strategy. This is what, in military terms, we call a nascent doctrine. Nascent doctrine is a doctrine that's made up on the fly. So you make it up as you go along. So when the British forces arrived in South Africa in 1899, there was no concept of blockhouse system. There were some armored trains in the Cape Colony in South Africa. There was no idea of the drives. There was certainly no idea of concentration camps and no idea of a scorched earth policy. But these are the components that were used to defeat the Boer commandos. And in the book, I try and explain that, how they came about and why they came about. So to Kitchener's strategy, as it was developed, threat and counter-threat, we end up with a denial of movement and capture, which is what I've just explained to you. Series of drives, blockhouse system, and armored trains onto which you're going to drive people. And then the second part of it is the removal of the supporting infrastructure. And this is kind of a fundamental component to warfare. It was back then, it was pretty abhorrent at the time. And guess what? It's still happening today. If you look at the war that's happening in Ukraine, this is exactly what's happening. The Russians, step by step, are removing all of Ukraine's supporting infrastructure, destroying everything it can in terms of electricity, especially coming into winter, railheads, infrastructure. You may not call it quite scorched earth policy, but that's exactly what they're doing. If you look at the war in Gaza, exactly what's been done in Gaza, scorched earth to a T, I would say. So all those things we talk about in history, where we say, well, it's really important to kind of preserve these things because we as humans, we need to learn from them. Actually, generationally, humans are very bad at learning the lessons from warfare and continue to repeat, if you like, the same mistakes, or we continue to use the same strategy over a number of times. And how does warfare play out in the end? Well, it plays out like this. This is a graph that kind of summarizes how the blockhouse system was used during the final phases of the war. This is a graph drawn with a logarithmic scale, but as you can see, whether it's 9,000 blockhouses that were built, or 29,000 Boers that were captured over the same period, or 69 drives that were conducted by Kitchener and his forces, the graphs look very similar. And what this graph shows is, over a period of 17 months, is a gradual degradation of combat efficiency. So if you look at what started off as around 60,000 Boers into the field during the guerrilla phase, over 17 months, this is reduced to a force that's non-combatant. It's virtually, got no horses left. Everything is threadbare. They're having to scavenge off the land. So it's become a war of attrition, which is pretty much like what we're seeing in both the conflicts that are pushing us towards some sort of greater conflict. War in Ukraine is almost stalemated like World War I, and what's happening in Gaza is very similar to this. It's a war of attrition until there's nothing left. So how history repeats itself. So that kind of concludes the bit about explaining about the Boer War. Let me just carry on with really what's kind of left. And what I wanted to do was capture a field guide. So what I've done in my field guide is capture all the kind of key blockhouse sites that were left. And this book followed on about 2 years after I'd done the last one. I wanted it to be color. I'm a photographer. One of the gentlemen was saying blockhouses are much easier to photograph because they don't have feathers and wings. Well, ain't that the truth? So I love my landscape photography as well as my bird photography, but I wanted my pictures to be in the book and I wanted it to be in color. So the field guide really is a canter through all the sites, 72 sites and about 100 blockhouses. Some sites like, where are we down here? Aliwal North, down here is a great place to visit because it's got 3 blockhouses. Burgersdorp, 2 blockhouses. Where am I looking here? Montague got 5 small forts. So a lot of these places have got a few places to visit. And interestingly enough, when I did the book, I said I wasn't going to do another one, and it's been issued as a kind of limited edition, because if I was to rewrite it now, some of these blockhouses are going to getting crossed out. They've been destroyed. This one at Voortrekkerhoek here in Pretoria, on SANDF land, on the estate of the government. Guess what? Bulldozed by the SANDF with an SANDF bulldozer. Put a bulldozer through it one day because some guy was running a shebeen in it. They didn't check with the estate manager what it was, and it's a national monument that's gone pretty much forever. We've managed to recover a part of it to the Voortrekker monument where they're going to reconstruct it. But it's sad. Our heritage is disappearing because nobody cares about it. So in my kind of quest looking at heritage, and we're coming back to some more genealogy in a minute. These are some of the sites that have been restored. This one is at Norval's Pond. It's on private property. It was a lovely story. A guy who was an engineer for the Harry Dam. He bought it, renovated it, turned it into a 4-bedroom home where he brought his family. And I happened to visit there when he was invited me in for tea, and we had a lovely chat. Got a use and a purpose. And for me, this is how heritage is going to survive in this country, is if it's got a use and it's got a purpose and it's got some foot traffic to it. Here's another one. Stormberg Junction. The lady who owns this particular blockhouse has converted it into a kind of stopover. It's kind of like a bothy, really. No running water. There's toilets outside. But you can stay in there, kind of bed and your own breakfast, Tommy Atkins style. Spent a pretty miserable night there with my young son, I have to say, but we stayed in it nevertheless and had a real kind of good experience. My son, this has got to be about, must be around 2010, I guess now. He's now ginormous. He's about 6 centimeters taller than me, going on 2 meters. So you can tell how long my journey has taken. It's taken a long time to get to telling the full story. Some of them are well looked after. Wolseley, there's a couple of blockhouses. This is managed by the local tourism office. Well worth a visit. You can get the key. Oopsie, I'm back up. You can get the key and somebody will give you a guided tour. This was one in Warrington, picture in 1990. And this is when I visited it in 2015, virtually destroyed. Built with very loose mortar and really not survived very well at all. So that one also gone. This is on government lands. You would have thought it would have survived pretty well. It had the plaque on it, which is quite surprising, but again, in a very poor state and has got worse since, I have to say. So the location of it doesn't really matter so much and who's looking after it. It's whether there's any foot traffic and whether it's got a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, it's not creating income for anybody, then it's probably not going to survive. No, that's my kind of prognosis. So what happens with soldiers sitting in blockhouses? Well, here is a couple of inscriptions from one of the blockhouses on Basutu Hill overlooking Harrismith. Harrismith was a garrison town. What I've found out in my research is the names that are scrawled on these blockhouses, bearing in mind this blockhouse is probably built in mid to late 1901. You would imagine these are Boer War inscriptions. Well, maybe not. You go to some of them where you can find inscriptions from with South African infantry on them. So these blockhouses were used in the Boer War. There was no mandate in the Treaty of Vereniging to destroy these blockhouses. Much as people say, it's another myth that people tell me that there was a mandate, the Treaty of Vereniging said they all had to be torn down and destroyed. Well, if you read the treaty, sorry, it ain't in there. There was no mandate to destroy them, so they were largely left. Some were sold off to local farmers, some were scavenged and taken by local farmers for building material, and some were owned by the government. And it's interesting, the legacy of some of the wars around South Africa, how they become current day sites. So if you go and look at the Frontier War posts built in the Frontier War on the Eastern Cape around 1860, become the local SAPS station. And many of these inscriptions are actually not from the Boer War. I've been looking for these guys. Private Clapper. You would think with a name like Private Clapper, he'd be relatively easy to find in genealogical terms. But can I find this oak? Can't find him. H. Smith. I can find plenty of H. Smiths, but no service record and no medal roll at the moment. So I'm guessing that the blockhouses were used post-Boer War, well up to 2010 with the new South Africa, and then into World War I, through the rebellion, 1914, and some of them into World War II as well. What starts out as a structure for the Anglo-Boer War becomes, if you like, a piece of legacy-built environment. And it's still standing. These blockhouses in Harrismith don't have any roofs on anymore, but it's still got the inscriptions on. So here we've got what I call the kind of genealogical archaeology parts of it. And my aim is to track these guys down, hopefully find a picture and find some medals for them. And this is what got me on looking at the kind of the bush art and the battlefield art, where bored soldiers take their spoon over a lunch break or whilst they're on guard outside and carve their name or their regiment's name into the blockhouse. And both these blockhouses are built of sandstone, so it leaves some nice marks. Recently, because I'd started doing presentations to metal detectors, I've started to come across artifacts that come out the ground with soldiers' details on. And these are dog tags that were found in Potchefstroom with bearing soldiers' names. And one of the ones I found had the name of Sergeant Bricknell on, of the Royal Field Artillery. Sergeant E. Bricknell, Royal Field Artillery, which originally we thought was Boer War, but is not Boer War because the first ID tags were not introduced into the British Army until 1908. So left us with a bit of a quandary. So what were these guys doing in Potchefstroom 1908 onwards, or around that period afterwards? So this is where, again, the genealogy starts to kick in, and finding his attestation papers, we can start to build the story of Sergeant Bricknell from the artillery. Sergeant Bricknell from the artillery joined in 1899, prior to the Boer War, and did actually come on the Boer War. He was part of 128th Battery and came to the Anglo-Boer War. So it does have Anglo-Boer War medals. Is the medal roll. I'm hoping to be able to track these down, and either I buy the medals and reunite the ID tag, or I reunite the ID tag with the medals. We'll see how the story plays out. He got married before he left in 1899, and this, off his attestation papers, says that he did in fact fight 5th of December 99 to March 03. So that puts him in the South African War. He then came home. he then did another period in South Africa, 06 to 1910, which puts it smack bang in the period of when the first ID tags were issued. So we reckon that the burn pit that we've had all these ID tags from is from 1908 in Potchefstroom. And what came out of Potchefstroom site? A whole load of artillery stuff and a whole load of Lancer and Dragoon stuff. How does that relate today? Well, if you know your military history and you know your SADF history and your SANDF history, you'll know that as a result of how the Boer War was fought and how British forces were stationed there, and the legacy through 1908 and 1910, the Potchefstroom is actually the home of the South African artillery, and it's also the equestrian centre of South Africa as well, South African military. So these legacy things that happened 120 odd years ago kind of pull through into what's happened today. I found some spurs, we found some cap badges and Lancer stuff. So there must have been probably 4 or 5 Lancer regiments stationed throughout that period in Potchefstroom. Each regiment had 600 horses, plus minus, and mules and saddles and what, and a lot of it falls off. And some of the stuff that falls off or gets used has names and regimental numbers on, which tell a story. And this is what I like to do: tell a story with something now that kind of comes out of the ground. And the lady who did this research for me, because I wasn't able to at the time, traced Edwin Henry Bricknell through his family line to relatives that live today. What happened to Bricknell was in 1910, he left the army, emigrated to Australia, and actually died there in 1926. And this is where he's buried, in Karakata Cemetery in Australia. So I'm hoping at some point to either get reunited with a living relative of this guy whose ID tag I found, or find his medals for the family. So what else comes out the ground? Well, plenty of stuff. Here we've had, this is a button cleaner. Anybody again who's been in the military, this has got 2 prongs. You put your kind of button in here and you're able to clean it with Brasso, and this has got a regimental number on it. It's actually got 2 on it. One is crossed out and one is added. So with the provenance of knowing where this button cleaning tool was found, you can probably associate that with a regiment and work out probably who that was, or 2 people who own that particular button cleaning tool. This one is much easier. Not only does it tell you it's the Queen's Own West Kent Regiment, it belonged to S. Barnes, and there, whoopsie, there is his regimental number. And this is the bed plate. So probably came from some sort of base depot where he had a proper bed to sleep in. So every soldier's bed had a bed plate on it, and a lot of these do come out of the ground. And again, we've got an equipment tag here, 4th Queen's Own Hussars. We're not quite sure what TYE means. I haven't worked that one out yet. I've got a feeling it's the name of his horse, but it's just a wild guess. But again, trace this guy in the Queen's Own Hussars, regimental number. Good. Cordwell is a relatively unique name. I guess you won't find many Cordwells. So this one tag that came out of the ground is going to tell a story. It's going to tell a story somewhere along the line. So that has been just under an hour through what I have been doing. I'll finish kind of by summing up and telling you where you can kind of find the books if you're interested. So we started off in the battlefields of World War One through my history. This for me is like the Greek god Janus. The Greek god Janus had 2 faces. One looked back into history and the other looked forward. And that's wherever we stand in our genealogy, that's kind of what we're doing. We're looking back at the past and looking forward into kind of what's coming tomorrow and the next day. And I hope in telling the story of blockhouses, you will have at least understood a little bit more about where they came from, how they were developed, how they came into being, the quantity of kind of sheer manpower that was involved all across the country, and the legacy items that are still being dug out the ground and discovered on the hilltops of South Africa. People are writing to me nearly every week saying, I found this inscription on a plate somewhere. The last story I'll tell you, because African heritage is all about stories. On one particular hilltop, there was a heliograph station. And at the heliograph station, the guys decided they were going to play chess. So on a flat piece of rock, they carved a chessboard and made some pieces and decided to play chess up there, which was all well and good. Bored soldiers will find something to do. They probably taught each other chess with their own rules. As they were going along, this becomes even too boring for them. So they decided to play chess with their comrades down on the local farm, who were about 2-3 kilometers away. So they played it with a heliograph, flashing a heliograph and doing the moves by heliograph, which was all well and good. So they did this for a few months. Unbeknownst to them, what happens was, and I'll, for the want of a better word, and you'll please excuse my pun on the names, Frikkie van der Merwe, who lived in the farm, who was a Afrikaans speaker and a local farmer, could also play chess and also had a mirror. And little did they know, they weren't playing chess with their fellow soldiers. They ended up playing chess with Frikkie van der Merwe, who jumped in the middle of the heliograph chess game that was going on. And that's another kind of interesting story just to finish up with. So thank you very much for your attention. On the screen there is where you can get the books from. Have a website you can buy off, www.blokhhuise.co.za, or if you prefer, please buy from me directly. And you can contact me at simonbsr@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. Both books are very different and tell different parts of the story that I've kind of explained to you tonight. And the final bit on the right-hand side there is an app called Road Trip SA, which kindly feature all the blockhouse locations that I put in the field guide. And for 70 Rand is a really good little tour guide if you're going up and down the country for finding some different spots to go and visit. So thank you very much. David, back to you. For me, the interesting thing is finding somebody's name scrawled on a wall and telling the story. I went to a symposium where there was a guy studying a place called Kruger's Cave in Magaliesburg. Kruger's Cave really had little to do with Kruger, but a lot to do with thousands of years of rock art. And we were talking to each other, and he said, you know what? He said, the stuff I'm studying that's called rock art is your soldier's graffiti. So somebody's graffiti is somebody else's rock art. And sand rock art done thousands of years with red handprints and stuff like that. We're kind of revering, whoa, it's thousands of years old. But one day, these scrawlings that says, Tommy Atkins was here, is going to be somebody's rock art.
Simon, do the blockhouses, or did the system extend into, let me say, Mozambique or Southwest Africa, Namibia? Or did it stop on the border?
It stopped on the border. It's definitely stopped on the border into Lesotho. Definitely stopped on the border. Didn't go into Mozambique. But it did go as far as what was called Crocodile Ports or Crocodile River, which is Gaborone. So it went as far as Gaborone, which I think was a British protectorate as well at the time. So it went up on, if you visualize a map of South Africa, it went up from, I think it's Vryburg, up through Mafeking, and then to Crocodile Ports, which was Gaborone. So the only place it went out of the kind of traditional borders, today's borders of South Africa, is on the western side. Okay, from the top, do you have an accurate number of blockhouses built and how many still standing? Yes, I do. Blockhouses only, I think, I'm up to 9,200. That is a mixture of actuals and estimated, and the estimated is done through calculations and estimations more detailed than it's ever been done before. We were joking at the start of it that I've termed myself the Blockhouse detective, and that's kind of what I've become. My aim is to turn the work I've done into a doctorate, maybe next year, and become Dr. Blockhouse. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? With a view to taking over from Gate Mackenzie and becoming Minister of Blockhouses. Because somebody at one point suggested that wouldn't it be good if all the railways and power lines in the country were protected by blockhouses? To which I said, that's a stunning idea. I'm ready to be Minister of Blockhouses at any point in the future. So I do have an accurate number. It's about 9,200. How many still standing? It's around 100, plus minus. Depends what you term as standing. In the guidebook, anything above waist height, I think, was the kind of the cutoff. If it wasn't above waist height, and it wasn't worth looking at, and I didn't put it in. But there's about 100 in there. And I'm discovering a few more here and there. What's interesting is I'm discovering a few on the farms in the Karoo. What they did by repurposing in the Karoo is they literally took the blockhouse up. I mean, they must have picked it up with a crane and lifted it and put it on the farm, because I found some very, very intact blockhouses on the farm.
Yeah. So, Simon, thank you for a most fascinating and interesting talk. It's certainly a subject that I don't think that people spend enough attention on in this country. And some of the things that interested me, that there was, as a Virgo, a bird watcher, and a contractor and an engineer, that there were concrete blockhouses built. And of course, a lot of us remember stories of World War II, when the French emptied bags of sugar into concrete structures that were supposed to support, and not many people know that sugar and concrete hate each other, and in fact concrete can't set where it's got added a bit of sugar in, added it to us. And I'm very glad to see that you are bandishing this out. Certainly these things definitely need preservation. Your remarks about spoons cutting names into blocks. When I had to do military service, we never used a spoon to mark things. We used to use a bayonet, and I don't know whether that was true or not. And to see your button cleaning tool was a reminder. I had 3 or 4 button cleaning tools from my grandfather, my father, my father-in-law, and myself for cleaning those terrible buttons with Brasso. But thank you very much for a most entertaining talk. And I hope that lots of our members purchase your books, and good luck to you. I think you're doing a great job. Thank you very much.